The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets of Denver as Marcus Thompson crouched behind the rusted remains of a delivery truck, his weathered hands gripping a makeshift spear fashioned from a broken street sign and reinforcing steel. 3 years had passed since the outbreak began, and the 42-year-old former engineer had learned that survival wasn't just about strength or speed, it was about thinking 2 steps ahead of the mindless horde that now ruled the world. Behind him, whispered voices carried the tension of their desperate situation. Elena Rodriguez, a former army medic whose quick thinking had saved countless lives in their survivor camp, was treating Jake Williams, a 20-something college student whose leg had been injured during their latest supply run. The group of 12 survivors had been forced to venture into the city's dangerous downtown district because their mountain hideout was running critically low on medical supplies and ammunition. What should have been a quick in-and-out mission had turned into a nightmare when they discovered that the zombies weren't behaving like the mindless wanderers they'd grown accustomed to fighting. These creatures moved with purpose, almost as if they were being coordinated by some unseen intelligence. Marcus had first noticed it 2 hours earlier when they'd entered the old hospital complex. The zombies hadn't simply swarmed them in their usual chaotic fashion, but had instead seemed to funnel them toward specific corridors, cutting off escape routes with an efficiency that made his blood run cold. Tommy Chen, their group scout and former police officer, had been the first to voice what they were all thinking: something had changed about their enemy, and not for the better. The realization hit them harder when they witnessed a group of zombies actually working together to stack debris and create a makeshift ladder to reach survivors who had taken refuge on a fire escape. Dr. Patricia Hayes, their resident scientist who had been studying the virus since the early days, theorized that the pathogen might be evolving, developing a primitive form of collective intelligence that allowed the infected to coordinate their attacks. This theory became terrifyingly real when they found themselves trapped in the hospital's east wing, with zombies systematically blocking every exit while others began a methodical search of each floor. The group's youngest member, 16-year-old Ashley Parker, whose parents had died protecting the camp 6 months earlier, suggested they might be dealing with some sort of alpha zombie, a more advanced infected individual capable of controlling the others. Her idea was met with skepticism until they heard it, a low, guttural howling that echoed through the hospital corridors, followed immediately by a coordinated response from hundreds of zombie voices throughout the building. The sound sent chills down Marcus's spine because it wasn't the random moaning they'd grown used to. It was communication, pure and simple. David Kim, their group strategist and former chess champion, quickly began analyzing the patterns in the zombie movements they'd observed, noting that the creatures were employing basic military tactics like flanking maneuvers and coordinated advances. His observations were interrupted when Elena called out in an urgent whisper that she could see movement in the street below, not just zombies, but what appeared to be a massive gathering unlike anything they'd witnessed before. Hundreds of zombies were converging on their location from all directions, moving in organized columns rather than the usual chaotic swarms. Rebecca Stone, their sharpshooter and former Olympic marksman, estimated their numbers at over 1,000 and climbing, while Michael Foster, the group's demolitions expert and former Marine, grimly calculated that their remaining ammunition wouldn't last more than a few minutes against such overwhelming odds. The situation grew even more desperate when they realized the zombies weren't just surrounding the building, they were building something, using abandoned vehicles and debris to construct what looked like siege equipment, as if they understood the concept of warfare beyond simple attack and overwhelm. Marcus felt the weight of leadership pressing down on him as he realized they were facing an enemy that had retained enough intelligence to learn, adapt, and strategize, while still possessing the relentless hunger and fearlessness that made zombies so dangerous in the first place. The group's communication specialist, Lisa Anderson, managed to establish brief radio contact with their base camp 20 miles away, learning that similar coordinated attacks were happening simultaneously across the region, suggesting this wasn't just a local phenomenon but part of a larger, organized assault on human settlements. As the zombie forces continued to mass outside their building and the strange howling grew louder and more frequent, Marcus knew they were witnessing the beginning of what could be humanity's final war, a conflict where their enemy had retained the mindless hunger that made them nearly unstoppable, while gaining the tactical intelligence that had once been humanity's greatest advantage. The sound of systematic pounding began echoing through the building as the zombies started their coordinated assault, and Marcus realized that everything they thought they knew about fighting these creatures was about to be put to the ultimate test. The systematic pounding grew stronger as Marcus watched through the cracked window, his heart racing when he witnessed something that defied everything he thought he knew about their undead enemies. The zombies were using tools, actually wielding crowbars and hammers with deliberate precision rather than their usual mindless clawing and biting. Elena quickly moved between the injured members of their group, her medical training keeping her focused even as the building shuddered under the coordinated assault, while Jake struggled to stand despite his injured leg, insisting he could still fight even though his pale complexion told a different story. The howling sound came again, this time much closer, and Tommy immediately recognized it as coming from inside the building itself, which meant their enemy had already breached the lower floors while they'd been focused on the forces gathering outside. Dr. Hayes frantically scribbled notes in her journal, documenting everything they were witnessing because she understood that if any of them survived this encounter, the information about the zombies' evolved behavior could be crucial for other survivor communities. Ashley clutched her father's hunting rifle with white knuckles, the teenager's bravery evident even as her voice trembled when she reported seeing zombies on the fire escapes outside, moving with the careful coordination of trained soldiers rather than stumbling corpses. David's strategic mind worked overtime as he studied the attack patterns, realizing that the zombies weren't just trying to overwhelm them with numbers, they were systematically eliminating escape routes while leaving one corridor deliberately open, as if herding the survivors toward a specific location. Rebecca positioned herself at the window with her sniper rifle, picking off key zombies that seemed to be directing others, but her tactical advantage was quickly neutralized when the creatures began using the bodies of their fallen as shields, demonstrating a level of battlefield awareness that made her blood run cold. Michael checked his remaining explosives, calculating that he had enough C4 to blow a hole through the hospital's exterior wall, but the blast would likely bring down part of the building and there was no guarantee they'd survive the collapse or the fall to the street below. The radio crackled with desperate transmissions from other survivor groups across the region, each reporting similar coordinated attacks that suggested this wasn't random evolution but some kind of planned offensive that had been building for months without their knowledge. Lisa worked frantically to coordinate with the other groups, trying to establish whether there was any pattern to the attacks that might reveal the zombies' ultimate objective, while the sounds of breaking glass and splintering wood echoed from the floors below as their pursuers methodically worked their way upward. Marcus made the difficult decision to split their group, sending the injured members with Elena toward the roof where Michael's explosives could potentially create an escape route, while the remaining fighters would attempt to hold off the advancing horde long enough for the others to reach safety. Tommy reported movement in the stairwells at both ends of their corridor, confirming that the zombies had successfully executed a pincer movement that would have impressed military tacticians, and their window for escape was rapidly closing. The building's lights suddenly flickered and died as the zombies cut the power, plunging the survivors into darkness broken only by the emergency lighting that cast eerie red shadows on the walls, while the howling grew louder and more frequent as if the creatures were communicating their progress to unseen commanders. Ashley's sharp eyes caught movement in the elevator shaft as zombies began climbing the cables with disturbing efficiency, their coordination so precise that it seemed impossible these were the same mindless creatures they'd been fighting for 3 years. Dr. Hayes suddenly grabbed Marcus's arm with excitement and terror, explaining that she just realized the zombies weren't just evolving, they were being controlled by something or someone with extensive military knowledge, possibly a surviving infected individual who retained their intelligence while gaining the ability to command others. Rebecca's sniper shots became more urgent as she tried to identify and eliminate what appeared to be zombie commanders in the street below, but for every one she dropped, 2 more seemed to take their place, suggesting a complex hierarchy that ran deeper than any of them had imagined. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside their barricaded room sent everyone into combat positions, while Michael prepared to detonate charges that would either save their lives or end them all in a burst of concrete and flame. David whispered urgently that he'd identified a pattern in the zombie movements that suggested they were being deliberately driven toward the hospital's research wing, where classified government experiments had been conducted before the outbreak, raising terrifying questions about what the creatures might be seeking in those abandoned laboratories. As the door to their makeshift fortress began to splinter under coordinated zombie assault, Marcus realized they were facing an enemy that had somehow retained human intelligence while losing human restraint, creating the perfect predator specifically designed to hunt down the last remnants of humanity with ruthless efficiency. The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and twisted metal as the first wave of zombies poured through the opening, but Marcus was stunned to see they didn't immediately charge. Instead, they formed a semicircle and waited, their glowing eyes fixed on the survivors with an intelligence that made his skin crawl, while behind them emerged a figure that had once been human but now stood over 7 feet tall with grotesquely elongated limbs and a skull that pulsed with visible veins. Elena's voice caught in her throat as she recognized the creature from medical files she'd seen before the outbreak, Dr. Jonathan Briggs, the lead researcher on Project Mindbridge, a classified government program that had been attempting to create a neural network between human subjects using a modified rabies virus. And the horrifying realization hit her that this wasn't evolution but the intended result of deliberate experimentation. Tommy opened fire immediately, his bullet striking the massive creature center mass, but instead of falling, it simply tilted its head and let out a complex series of sounds that caused every zombie in the building to respond with coordinated movement, like pieces on a chessboard being directed by a master strategist. Jake limped forward despite his injury, swinging a crowbar at the nearest zombie, but the creature caught his weapon mid-swing and twisted it from his grasp with surgical precision, demonstrating fine motor control that should have been impossible for the infected. Ashley's rifle cracked repeatedly as she targeted the smaller zombies, buying precious seconds while Michael worked frantically to position his explosive charges, but the creatures seemed to anticipate each shot and moved with fluid grace that made them nearly impossible to hit. Dr. Hayes shouted over the chaos that the tall creature wasn't just controlling the others, it was learning from their encounter in real time, adapting its tactics based on each action the survivors took, which meant their enemy was becoming more dangerous with every passing moment. David's strategic mind raced as he realized they were facing something far worse than coordinated zombies. They were confronting the successful merger of human intelligence with viral adaptability, creating a hive mind that could think, plan, and learn while remaining utterly devoid of human empathy or moral restraint. Rebecca's sniper fire became more desperate as zombies began pouring through the windows on cables and ropes, their movements so coordinated that she realized they'd been planning this assault for weeks, possibly months, studying human behavior patterns and preparing countermeasures for every possible escape route. The creature that had been Dr. Briggs stepped forward and spoke in a voice that was horrifyingly human despite the physical transformation, explaining in calm, measured tones that humanity's time was ending and that resistance was not only futile but counterproductive to the greater evolutionary leap that was taking place. Lisa's radio crackled with final transmissions from survivor communities across the state, each reporting similar encounters with evolved zombies led by transformed humans who retained their knowledge and personalities while serving the collective consciousness that was spreading across the infected population. Michael's hands shook as he realized that his explosives might not be enough to stop creatures that could think and plan as well as any human military commander, while the building continued to shake under the coordinated assault of hundreds of zombies who were methodically dismantling every possible escape route. Elena made the agonizing decision to inject Jake with their last morphine to ease his pain, knowing that their medical supplies would be meaningless if none of them survived the next few minutes, while Ashley moved closer to Marcus, her young face set with determination that reminded him painfully of her deceased parents. Tommy's ammunition ran dangerously low as more zombies flooded through the breach, but he noticed that they were carefully avoiding damage to certain equipment in the room, suggesting they needed something specific from this location rather than simply wanting to kill the survivors. The transformed Dr. Briggs gestured toward the sealed laboratory doors at the far end of the corridor, explaining that the survivors had unknowingly led them to the exact location they'd been seeking, the storage facility containing the original viral samples and research data that would allow them to accelerate their species-wide transformation. Dr. Hayes felt a chill of pure terror as she understood that their enemy didn't just want to kill them, they wanted to use the survivors' knowledge and the laboratory's resources to perfect their viral evolution and spread it globally at an unprecedented rate. Rebecca's scope revealed zombies positioning what appeared to be communication equipment on nearby rooftops, suggesting they were coordinating not just locally but across vast distances, possibly even internationally, indicating that this assault was part of a worldwide operation. David whispered urgently that if the creatures gained access to the research data, they would have everything needed to create targeted viruses that could overcome human immune systems and turn entire populations in a matter of hours rather than days. As Michael prepared to detonate charges that might bring down the entire wing of the building, Marcus realized they were facing the final moments of humanity's war for survival, and their next decision would determine whether the human race had any future at all. The deafening explosion rocked the entire building as Michael's charges detonated, but instead of bringing down the laboratory wing as planned, the blast only managed to seal off one corridor while creating a gaping hole that revealed the true scope of their nightmare. Thousands of zombies stretched across the city in perfectly organized formations, all moving toward their location with military precision that suggested this hospital had been their primary objective from the very beginning. Marcus grabbed Ashley's hand and pulled her toward the emergency stairwell as chunks of concrete rained down around them, while Elena and Tommy worked together to carry the injured Jake, whose condition was deteriorating rapidly from blood loss and shock. The transformed Dr. Briggs let out another series of complex vocalizations that caused the zombie horde to shift their attack pattern instantly, with some creatures beginning to scale the exterior walls while others started systematic demolition of the building's support structures, as if they intended to bring down the entire hospital in a controlled collapse. Rebecca's sniper rifle cracked repeatedly as she provided covering fire from the stairwell, but her shots were becoming less effective as the zombies learned to anticipate her targeting patterns and began using coordinated movements that made individual kills nearly impossible. Dr. Hayes clutched her research notes desperately, realizing that her documentation of the evolved zombie behavior might be the only hope for other survivor communities to develop effective countermeasures against this new threat, if any of them managed to escape with the information intact. David's tactical analysis revealed that the zombies weren't just trying to capture the laboratory, they were systematically destroying every piece of equipment and research data except for specific items they seemed to recognize, suggesting that the transformed Dr. Briggs retained detailed knowledge of the original experiments and knew exactly what he needed to complete his horrifying project. Lisa's radio received one final transmission from their mountain base camp, reporting that massive zombie armies were converging on survivor settlements across 3 states, confirming that this wasn't an isolated attack but the opening move in a coordinated campaign to eliminate organized human resistance once and for all. Ashley's sharp eyes spotted movement in the hospital's lower levels through the hole Michael's explosion had created, and she realized with growing horror that the zombies had been using the building's basement tunnels to position themselves throughout the structure while the survivors had been focused on the obvious threats from above. Tommy's police training kicked in as he organized their retreat up the stairwell, but every floor they climbed revealed more evidence that the zombies had been planning this assault for months, with strategic supplies cached throughout the building and structural modifications that would funnel survivors toward predetermined kill zones. Elena's medical expertise told her that Jake was going into shock and wouldn't survive much longer without proper treatment, but the nearest safe medical facility was over 50 miles away through territory that was now crawling with evolved zombies who could think and plan like human military commanders. Michael checked his remaining explosives and grimly calculated that he had enough firepower to bring down the entire stairwell, potentially buying the others time to reach the roof, but the sacrifice would trap him with the advancing zombie horde and guarantee his death. The building structure groaned ominously as the systematic demolition continued below, while the transformed Dr. Briggs could be heard coordinating the attack through a series of sounds that resembled some nightmarish combination of human speech and animal calls, demonstrating that the creature had developed an entirely new form of communication. Rebecca noticed that certain zombies were carrying what appeared to be primitive tools and weapons, suggesting that the infected weren't just retaining intelligence but were actively manufacturing equipment and planning for extended campaigns against human settlements. Dr. Hayes made the desperate decision to destroy her own research notes rather than risk them falling into enemy hands, but before she could burn the papers, David stopped her and pointed out that the information might be their only hope of developing a cure or at least a more effective resistance strategy. Ashley's rifle fire became more precise as adrenaline sharpened her focus, but she was running dangerously low on ammunition and realized that their small group couldn't hold off hundreds of coordinated attackers for much longer, especially when their enemy could adapt and counter their tactics in real time. The sound of helicopters suddenly filled the air outside the building, and Lisa's radio exploded with military communications as what appeared to be a major rescue operation began deploying around the hospital, though Marcus wondered grimly whether conventional military tactics would be effective against an enemy that retained human intelligence while possessing superhuman physical capabilities. Tommy reached the roof access door first and found it barricaded from the outside, which meant the zombies had anticipated their escape route and positioned forces to cut them off, demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that rivaled the best human military planners. As the stairwell filled with the sounds of pursuing zombies and the building continued to shake under the coordinated assault, Marcus realized they were witnessing the moment when humanity's technological and tactical advantages were being systematically neutralized by an enemy that combined the best aspects of human intelligence with the relentless drive and physical superiority of the infected. The helicopters circling overhead weren't military rescue units as they'd hoped, but rather news crews and government surveillance aircraft documenting what appeared to be a controlled experiment, and Lisa's radio intercepted chilling communications revealing that the hospital had been designated as a testing ground for studying evolved zombie behavior against human survivors, making them unwitting lab rats in a continuation of the very experiments that had created this nightmare. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice as he realized they hadn't been trapped by accident, they'd been herded here deliberately as part of some larger study, while Tommy used his full weight against the roof access door that refused to budge despite their combined efforts to break through the barricade. Elena worked frantically to stabilize Jake's deteriorating condition using supplies from her rapidly dwindling medical kit, but his pulse was growing weaker and his skin had taken on the grayish pallor that often preceded infection, forcing her to make the terrible decision of whether to use their last antibiotic shot or save it for someone who might have a better chance of survival. The sound of helicopter rotors grew closer as one aircraft descended toward the hospital's roof, but instead of rescue personnel, heavily armed figures in hazmat suits began rappelling down, their weapons trained not on the zombies but on the survivors themselves, confirming Marcus's worst fears about their true purpose in this location. Dr. Hayes screamed in recognition as she identified one of the hazmat-suited figures as Dr. Elizabeth Crawford, her former colleague and co-researcher on Project Mindbridge, whose involvement meant that the government had been monitoring and manipulating survivor groups throughout the outbreak, using them as test subjects for zombie evolution studies. Ashley's hunting rifle swung toward the descending figures, but Rebecca quickly stopped her, explaining that firing on what appeared to be government personnel would make them criminals even if they survived this encounter, though the distinction seemed meaningless when faced with people who were treating them like expendable research material. David's strategic mind raced as he analyzed their impossible situation, trapped between evolved zombies below who wanted to capture them for their own purposes and government forces above who apparently viewed them as test subjects rather than human beings deserving rescue. The roof access door suddenly exploded outward as Michael's final explosive charge cleared the barricade, but instead of freedom, they found themselves facing a corridor filled with zombies that had been positioned there specifically to drive them back toward the government forces, creating a perfect pincer movement that eliminated any possibility of escape. Tommy drew his service weapon and took aim at the nearest zombie, but hesitated when he realized the creature was wearing the uniform of a fellow police officer, someone he'd probably known before the outbreak, and the moment of recognition cost him precious seconds as more infected poured through the opening. Elena made the agonizing decision to inject Jake with their last morphine dose, knowing that his wounds were too severe for their limited medical supplies to treat, while she whispered reassurances that masked her growing certainty that none of them would survive to see another sunrise. The government team's radio communications revealed that they were under orders to capture at least 3 survivors alive for continued experimentation, while the rest were considered acceptable losses in service of gathering data about zombie-human interactions under extreme stress conditions. Lisa's equipment suddenly crackled with a new transmission from an unknown source, warning that the entire operation was being broadcast live to government facilities across the country, where other research teams were studying every aspect of their behavior to improve zombie effectiveness against future survivor communities. Michael grabbed Ashley and pulled her behind the rooftop air conditioning unit as gunfire erupted between the government forces and the zombies, both sides apparently willing to fight over the right to control the survivors' fate, while bullets ricocheted off metal surfaces in deadly crossfire patterns. Rebecca's sniper training allowed her to identify escape routes that others missed, and she pointed toward a maintenance ladder that led to an adjacent building's roof, but reaching it would require crossing 30 feet of open space under fire from multiple directions. Dr. Hayes clutched her research notes and made a desperate decision to shout everything she'd learned about zombie evolution to the government forces, hoping that sharing the information might convince them to prioritize evacuation over experimentation, but her words were lost in the chaos of gunfire and zombie howling. The transformed Dr. Briggs appeared in the doorway behind the zombie horde, his massive frame silhouetted against the emergency lighting as he surveyed the rooftop battle with the calm analytical gaze of a scientist observing a successful experiment, while his presence seemed to coordinate the zombies' movements with even greater precision. David realized with growing horror that they weren't just caught between two hostile forces, they were the central focus of a three-way battle where zombies, government forces, and survivors each had different objectives, but all three groups viewed human life as expendable in pursuit of their larger goals. As bullets flew overhead and zombie claws scraped against concrete, Marcus gathered his remaining team members and prepared for what might be their final coordinated action, knowing that their next decision would determine not just their own survival but possibly the fate of every remaining human community that was being watched and studied by the same forces that had orchestrated this nightmare scenario. Marcus made the split-second decision that would define their survival, grabbing a smoke grenade from Michael's tactical vest and hurling it into the center of the rooftop battle, creating a thick gray cloud that obscured everyone's vision while he shouted for his team to move toward Rebecca's identified escape route. But their coordinated sprint was immediately complicated by the government forces who began firing rubber bullets and deploying net launchers designed to capture rather than kill. Elena reluctantly left Jake's unconscious form behind cover, knowing that carrying him would doom them all, while tears streamed down her face as she made the impossible choice between saving one life and preserving the group's only chance of escape. Ashley's athletic training from high school track served her well as she reached the maintenance ladder first, but her ascent was slowed by the weight of her rifle and ammunition, while behind them the sound of zombie claws on metal indicated that Dr. Briggs's creatures were scaling the building's exterior walls with terrifying efficiency. Tommy provided covering fire as the others climbed, but his police-issued ammunition was running critically low, and he realized with growing dread that he might not have enough bullets left to hold off their pursuers long enough for everyone to reach safety. The government forces' radio chatter revealed that this entire scenario had been orchestrated as a field test for something called Protocol 7, which apparently involved using survivor communities as unwilling test subjects to study optimal zombie deployment strategies for future military applications. Dr. Hayes nearly lost her grip on the ladder when she heard Dr. Crawford's voice over the radio, calmly discussing how the survivor group's psychological responses under extreme stress were providing valuable data for predicting civilian behavior during planned zombie releases in populated areas. Rebecca reached the adjacent building's roof and immediately began providing sniper support, but her shots were hampered by the smoke and the need to avoid hitting her own team members who were still climbing through the chaos below. David's analytical mind processed the horrifying implications of what they were overhearing. The government wasn't trying to stop the zombie outbreak but was actively using it as a weapon, with survivor communities serving as both test subjects and potential targets for future deployment of evolved zombies against civilian populations. Lisa's communication equipment suddenly locked onto a pirate radio frequency where other survivor groups were reporting similar rescue operations that had turned into capture missions, revealing that their experience wasn't unique but part of a nationwide program to study and weaponize zombie behavior against human populations. Michael reached into his vest for his final explosive device, planning to destroy the ladder behind them to prevent pursuit, but hesitated when he realized that Jake was still on the rooftop below and the blast would certainly kill their injured teammate along with any pursuing enemies. Ashley called down from the safety of the adjacent roof that she could see military vehicles surrounding other buildings in the distance, with what appeared to be portable laboratories being set up to process captured survivors, confirming that this operation was far larger and more organized than any of them had imagined. The smoke began to clear just as Elena reached the top of the ladder, revealing that the government forces had managed to capture several zombies alive and were loading them into specialized containment units, while Dr. Briggs stood calmly among his creatures, apparently negotiating some kind of arrangement with the hazmat-suited researchers. Tommy made the agonizing decision to abandon his position and follow the others up the ladder, but not before he heard Jake's weak voice calling out from behind the air conditioning unit, begging not to be left alone with the creatures that were converging on his location. Rebecca's sniper scope revealed the true horror of the situation as she watched government personnel systematically tagging and cataloging both zombies and the equipment they'd been using, treating the evolved creatures like valuable research assets rather than the monsters that had been terrorizing human settlements for 3 years. Dr. Hayes shouted a warning that the government forces were preparing to deploy some kind of aerosol agent across the rooftop, possibly a sedative or paralytic that would incapacitate everyone in the area, making capture inevitable for anyone who remained exposed to the chemical cloud. David calculated their odds of survival and realized that even if they escaped this immediate situation, they were now fugitives from both zombie hordes and their own government, with nowhere to run and no safe communities to return to since all survivor settlements were apparently under surveillance and subject to similar experimental operations. Marcus was the last to reach the adjacent building, but as he pulled himself over the ledge, he could see Jake's motionless form surrounded by zombies and government personnel who were documenting every aspect of the interaction, treating his teammates' final moments as nothing more than valuable research data. The revelation that their own government had been using survivor communities as expendable test subjects while secretly collaborating with evolved zombie leadership hit the team like a physical blow, destroying their last hope that civilization and human decency still existed somewhere in the world. As they caught their breath on the new rooftop, Lisa's radio picked up a transmission that made their blood run cold. Similar operations were being conducted simultaneously across 12 states, with thousands of survivors being captured or eliminated as part of the largest human experimentation program in history, all designed to perfect zombie warfare for use against both domestic and international targets. The adjacent building's rooftop offered only temporary refuge as Marcus quickly identified government vehicles positioning themselves around the perimeter of the entire city block, while Lisa's radio intercepted coordination signals indicating that aerial surveillance drones were tracking their movement in real time using thermal imaging technology that made hiding nearly impossible. Elena struggled to process the emotional trauma of leaving Jake behind while simultaneously treating minor injuries the team had sustained during their escape, her medical training warring with her human instincts as she realized they might face similar impossible choices in the hours ahead. Ashley reloaded her rifle with their dwindling ammunition supply, her young hands steady despite the magnitude of what they discovered, while her sharp eyes scanned the surrounding buildings for signs of additional government forces or zombie deployments that might be converging on their location. Tommy's police experience proved invaluable as he studied the government vehicles' positioning patterns and realized they were being herded toward a specific area of the city, suggesting that their escape route was being manipulated just as cleverly as their initial capture had been orchestrated. Dr. Hayes frantically reviewed her research notes in the brief respite, her scientific mind racing to understand how the government could have developed such extensive cooperation with evolved zombie leadership, while the implications of voluntary human-zombie collaboration sent chills down her spine. Rebecca used her sniper scope to survey the zombie forces still surrounding the hospital and noticed that many creatures were now wearing crude but effective body armor fashioned from scavenged materials, indicating that their intelligence and tool use capabilities were advancing at an exponential rate. David's strategic analysis revealed that their current position was tactically untenable, with government forces controlling all obvious escape routes while zombie patrols systematically searched nearby buildings in a coordinated sweep pattern that would reach their location within minutes. Michael discovered that his explosive expertise might be their only advantage, as he identified structural weaknesses in the building that could create an underground escape route through the subway tunnels, though the plan would require precise timing and carry enormous risks. Lisa's communication intercepts revealed that the government operation had multiple phases, with survivor capture and zombie behavioral studies representing only the initial stage of what appeared to be preparation for large-scale deployment of weaponized zombies against civilian populations in major cities. The sound of helicopter rotors grew closer as additional aircraft joined the surveillance operation, while Ashley spotted rappelling equipment being deployed from several aircraft, indicating that capture teams were preparing for immediate deployment against their position. Elena made the difficult decision to destroy most of their medical supplies rather than allow them to fall into government hands, keeping only basic first aid materials that could be easily carried during their desperate escape attempt through unknown terrain. Tommy's radio crackled with police frequencies he still had access to, revealing that law enforcement agencies across multiple states had been federalized under emergency powers and were actively participating in survivor capture operations under the guise of evacuation and protection. Rebecca's military knowledge helped her identify the government forces' communication patterns, and she realized that their captors were using standard military protocols modified for urban warfare, suggesting that this entire operation had been planned and rehearsed long before being deployed against survivor communities. Dr. Hayes discovered additional pages in her research notes that she'd forgotten about, containing early warning signs from before the outbreak that government scientists had been deliberately accelerating viral mutation research despite obvious dangers to public safety. David calculated that their best chance of survival lay in reaching the industrial district where abandoned factories might provide cover and concealment, but the route would require crossing several blocks of open territory while under constant surveillance. Michael's demolition plan took shape as he identified a specific load-bearing wall that, if properly destroyed, would create access to a maintenance tunnel system that connected to the city's underground infrastructure, potentially allowing them to move undetected beneath government surveillance. Ashley volunteered to serve as rear guard during their escape attempt, despite being the youngest team member, arguing that her marksmanship skills and intimate knowledge of the terrain from her childhood in the city made her the logical choice for the dangerous assignment. The government forces began deploying what appeared to be sonic devices designed to incapacitate both humans and zombies, while the evolved creatures responded by covering their ears and retreating to predetermined positions, demonstrating that they'd been trained to expect and counter these specific tactics. Elena treated her teammates' injuries with growing efficiency born of desperate necessity, while her medical knowledge told her that stress and exhaustion were taking a serious toll on everyone's physical and mental capabilities. Lisa intercepted a transmission that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Project Mindbridge had never been intended to create a cure for the zombie virus but had always been designed to weaponize human intelligence within infected hosts, creating the perfect biological weapon for asymmetric warfare. Tommy's street knowledge of the city proved invaluable as he identified escape routes that wouldn't appear on government maps, including storm drains and abandoned subway tunnels that had been sealed off decades before the current crisis. As Marcus prepared to give the signal for Michael's explosive breach, he realized they were fighting not just for their own survival but for the future of human freedom itself, knowing that their escape would carry the burden of warning other survivor communities about the scope of the government betrayal that threatened to destroy what remained of human civilization. Michael's explosive charges detonated with precision timing, sending a controlled shockwave through the building's foundation that created the exact breach they needed while simultaneously triggering a cascade of structural failures that brought down several floors above them, providing perfect cover as government surveillance equipment was buried under tons of concrete and steel debris. Marcus led the team through the newly created opening into the maintenance tunnel system, where the narrow confines and total darkness provided protection from aerial surveillance while forcing them to rely on Ashley's intimate knowledge of the underground passages she'd explored as a curious child before the outbreak changed everything. Elena worked by flashlight to treat Tommy's shoulder injury sustained during the blast, her medical expertise proving invaluable as they navigated through cramped tunnels filled with pipes and electrical conduits that could easily cause additional injuries to team members who were already exhausted and operating on pure adrenaline. Lisa's portable radio equipment picked up increasingly frantic government communications as search teams discovered their escape route, but the underground location provided enough interference to prevent accurate tracking while allowing her to monitor enemy movements and coordinate their path through the maze of tunnels. Rebecca took point position with her rifle ready, using her military training to navigate by compass and memory through passages that hadn't been maintained for decades, while behind them the sound of pursuit grew fainter as the tunnel system proved too complex and dangerous for their heavily equipped pursuers to follow effectively. Dr. Hayes clutched her research notes protectively, knowing that the information they contained about government collaboration with evolved zombies represented the only hope for warning other survivor communities about the true scope of the threat they faced from their own leaders. David's strategic mind worked constantly to analyze their escape route and plan for contingencies, calculating distances and timing while listening for sounds that might indicate they were being tracked through the underground network by either government forces or zombie search teams. Tommy's police knowledge of the city's infrastructure proved crucial as he identified maintenance shafts that led to different sections of the tunnel system, allowing them to change direction and confuse any pursuit while moving steadily toward the industrial district where they hoped to find temporary sanctuary. Ashley's youthful energy kept the group moving when exhaustion threatened to overcome them, her determination fueled by the memory of her parents' sacrifice and her growing understanding that they carried responsibility for warning other survivors about the systematic betrayal being perpetrated by their own government. Michael monitored their backtrail for signs of pursuit while calculating the remaining explosives he carried, knowing that strategic demolition of tunnel sections might be necessary to prevent their enemies from following them to whatever safe location they eventually reached. The tunnel system gradually led them toward the outskirts of the city, where Elena's medical assessment indicated that everyone was suffering from various degrees of shock and exhaustion but remained capable of continuing their desperate journey to reach other survivor communities. Lisa's radio began picking up transmissions from independent survivor groups operating outside the government's surveillance network, providing hope that not all human settlements had been compromised and that their warning about Project Mindbridge might reach people who could organize effective resistance. Rebecca's military experience suggested that they establish contact with resistance cells that had apparently formed among military personnel who refused to participate in the survivor capture operations, indicating that not everyone in positions of authority had accepted the collaboration with evolved zombie forces. Dr. Hayes realized that her scientific knowledge combined with their first-hand experience of government betrayal made them uniquely qualified to help develop countermeasures against both zombie evolution and the technical surveillance systems being used to track survivor communities. Tommy's law enforcement background provided crucial insight into how they might establish secure communication networks that could operate outside government monitoring, while his knowledge of police procedures helped them avoid detection patterns that their pursuers would expect. David developed a comprehensive strategy for warning survivor communities across multiple states, using redundant communication methods and coded messages that would be difficult for government forces to intercept or decode while ensuring that vital information reached the people who needed it most. Ashley's determination to honor her parents' memory drove her to volunteer for dangerous reconnaissance missions that would help identify which survivor settlements remained independent and which had been compromised by government infiltration or direct assault. Michael's demolition expertise became central to their resistance planning, as his ability to destroy government surveillance equipment and zombie research facilities could seriously disrupt the ongoing experimentation program while buying time for evacuation of threatened communities. As they finally emerged from the tunnel system into the dawn light of a new day, Marcus realized that their desperate escape had transformed them from survivors into something much more important. They had become the resistance movement that humanity desperately needed, carrying the knowledge and determination necessary to expose the truth about government collaboration with evolved zombies and organize effective opposition to the forces that threatened to destroy human civilization entirely. Elena treated their various injuries while planning how to establish medical support networks for other resistance cells, knowing that their survival and continued mission depended on maintaining the health and capabilities of people who were fighting against overwhelming odds with limited resources. The radio crackled with distant transmissions from survivor groups who had received their initial warnings, and Lisa smiled grimly as she realized that their message was spreading faster than government forces could contain it, suggesting that humanity's fight for survival was entering a new phase where the real enemy had finally been identified and effective resistance could begin.